Her knees buckled in snow that reached her waist, and the dog pressed against her leg like he was trying to hold her upright through sheer will. Margaret Brennan was 78 years old, and she was dying on a mountain because 7 neighbors had looked through their peepholes and decided she wasn't their problem. The German Shepherd wouldn't move from the stranger's porch, wouldn't let her give up, and when the door finally opened, the man standing there looked like he'd spent 2 years trying to forget how to care about anyone. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss how this impossible night changed 3 broken lives. Let's begin. The cold wasn't the worst part. Margaret had been cold before, had survived Montana winters that turned cars into tombs and roads into rivers of ice. The worst part was the knowing. Knowing that every light in every window belonged to someone who'd heard her knock and chosen silence. Knowing that the paper in her coat pocket, the foreclosure notice with its clean corporate typeface, had more power than 50 years of mortgage payments. Knowing that if she stopped moving, even for a minute, her body would make the decision her mind kept avoiding. "Come on, Duke," she whispered, but her voice cracked halfway through his name. The German Shepherd looked up at her with those amber eyes that never seemed to blink, never seemed to judge. His left front paw touched the snow carefully, the old injury making him cautious. But he didn't slow down. He pushed forward, and she followed, because following Duke had kept her alive this long. The cabin appeared between the trees like something out of a memory. Small, dark, one window glowing the color of honey. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line that made Margaret think of prayers, the kind people sent up when they didn't have words left. Duke stopped at the porch. Just stopped, like he'd walked into an invisible wall. "Duke, please." Margaret's legs shook. "We can't." But the dog sat down in the snow, staring at the door with that focused intensity she'd seen before. The same look he'd had when the warehouse caught fire 6 years ago, when he'd run into smoke that should have killed him and dragged out a maintenance worker who'd been unconscious near the boiler room. The same look he'd had the night 2 men in clean coats had come to her house with papers that said she didn't own her life anymore. Duke knew things. Margaret had stopped questioning it years ago. She dragged herself up the 3 porch steps and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, and heard Duke's low whine behind her, not begging, warning. The door opened. The man who stood there didn't look like salvation. He looked like someone who'd taken every piece of softness in himself and locked it somewhere even he couldn't find it. Tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that came from work and not a gym. Beard dark and thick enough to hide most of his face. His eyes were gray-blue, the kind of gray that came before storms, and they took her in with a single sweeping glance that felt professional, measuring. He wore an old vest over a flannel shirt, leather worn smooth in places, with rectangular patches torn off where something had been sewn on and later removed. The kind of vest bikers wore. The kind that meant brotherhood, territory, loyalty. Margaret felt something in her chest tighten, but not with fear, with recognition. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. "Just one night. Just warm." The man stared at her for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then his eyes dropped to Duke, and something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, more like the door to a locked room opening just a crack. "You military?" he asked. "No," Margaret said, "but he was." "Search and rescue, before the fire." The man's jaw tightened. He looked at Duke again, and Duke stared back without aggression, without submission. Just steady, waiting. "Come in," the man said. The warmth hit her like a fist, and Margaret's knees went weak. She would have fallen if the man hadn't caught her elbow. Quick, efficient, the kind of touch that didn't linger. "Sit," he said, guiding her to a chair near the wood stove. She sat because her body didn't give her a choice. Duke followed her inside and immediately moved to the door, turning to face it, lowering himself into a position that looked restful, but wasn't. His ears stayed upright. His gaze never left the window. The man draped a blanket over her shoulders, and Margaret wanted to cry from the simple kindness of it. But she'd learned years ago that crying took energy she couldn't afford to waste. "What's his name?" the man asked. "Duke." "He always sit like that?" "Since the fire," Margaret said. "He doesn't trust closed spaces, or open ones, just watches." The man nodded once, like that made perfect sense. He moved through the cabin with careful economy, boiling water, pulling out a tin of soup, not making noise or conversation. Margaret watched him and felt the strange weight of being seen by someone who didn't need her to explain herself. When he handed her the mug of hot water, their fingers brushed, and she saw the scars on his knuckles. Old, layered, the kind that came from hitting things repeatedly. "I'm Maggie," she said, because silence felt heavier than words. The man hesitated. "Colt." "Thank you, Colt." He didn't answer, just returned to the stove and stirred the soup in a pot that looked too small for a man his size. Duke shifted, and Margaret saw Colt's attention snap toward the dog instantly. Not obvious, just a flicker of focus. The way soldiers moved. The way people who'd lived through violence moved. "You live up here alone?" she asked. "Yeah." "For how long?" 2 years. That's a long time to be alone." Colt's shoulders tightened, but his voice stayed level. "It's long enough." The soup was plain. Canned broth, dried vegetables, nothing fancy. But when Colt set it in her hands, Margaret closed her eyes and felt warmth spread through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "When did you eat last?" Colt asked. Margaret opened her eyes. "Yesterday morning." His jaw clenched. He ladled more soup into a second bowl and set it on the floor near Duke. The dog looked at it, then at Margaret, waiting for permission. "Go ahead, boy," she whispered. Duke ate slowly, precisely, pausing every few bites to lift his head and scan the room. Colt watched him with an expression Margaret couldn't quite name. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "What happened to his paw?" Colt asked. "Old fracture, healed wrong. Cold makes it worse." "I know the feeling." Margaret studied him. "You were hurt?" "Everyone gets hurt," Colt said, which wasn't an answer. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the wind hissing against the windows. Margaret felt the trembling in her hands start to ease, felt her breathing slow. Felt, for the first time in weeks, like she might actually survive the night. And then her bag slipped. She'd been adjusting the blanket, trying to settle more comfortably in the chair, and the canvas strap slid off her shoulder. The bag hit the floor with a soft thud, and the envelope inside skidded out across the worn wooden planks, stopping at Colt's boot. Duke's head snapped up instantly, ears forward, gaze locked on the paper like it carried a scent only he could smell. Colt froze, stared at the dog, then at the envelope. Margaret's throat closed. Colt bent down slowly and picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive, cold from being outside. The logo in the top corner was printed in blue and silver, Summit Property Solutions, and beneath it, in bold black letters, Notice of Foreclosure. Colt's eyes lifted to hers. "It's not what it looks like," Margaret said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. It was exactly what it looked like. Colt set the envelope on the table between them, face up, and sat back down without speaking. Margaret stared at it like it might come alive and bite her. "I had a house," she said quietly. "Cedar siding, porch that needed paint, garden out back where I used to grow tomatoes. Not big, just mine." Colt waited. "Storm came through 2 summers ago," Margaret continued. "Tore half the roof off. Insurance covered some, but not enough. I borrowed to fix it. Fixed income, you know? They said they specialized in helping people like me." Her voice cracked. "The interest climbed. Papers came with numbers I didn't recognize. I called. They said it was standard." She swallowed hard. 2 months later, they put the notice on my door and told me I had a week. "How long ago?" Colt asked. 3 weeks. "Where have you been staying?" Margaret looked at the fire. "Shelters, friends' couches, until the friends stopped answering, until the shelter said they couldn't keep extending. I tried." Her voice broke. "I tried everything." Duke moved then, limping slightly as he crossed the room and pressed his shoulder against her shin. Margaret's hand fell into his thick fur, and the tears came whether she wanted them to or not. Colt didn't tell her it would be okay, didn't offer false hope or empty comfort. He just sat there, still and present. And somehow that was worse, because it meant he understood how little hope actually meant when the system had already decided you were disposable. Duke suddenly turned toward the window, body going rigid. Colt's posture changed instantly, subtle, but Margaret saw it. Saw the way his weight shifted forward, the way his hands opened and closed once, like he was reminding them how to move. "What is it?" she whispered. "Don't know." Duke stared at the darkness beyond the glass, and Margaret followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing, just trees and snow and the vast black weight of the mountain. Then, she saw it. A flicker of light, far down the slope, moving between the trees. Not steady like a porch lamp. Moving. Deliberate. "They follow you up here?" Colt asked, voice low. Margaret's chest tightened. "Sometimes. To remind me." "Remind you of what?" "That I'm owned." Colt stood, and the movement was controlled, calm, the kind of calm that made Margaret think of deep water. He crossed to the window and stared out, eyes tracking the light as it disappeared, reappeared, disappeared again. Duke let out a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a warning offered to someone who'd understand it. Colt turned back to her, and in the firelight his face looked harder, older. "How many times they come around?" "Twice last week, once this week." "They threaten you?" Margaret hesitated. "Not in words." Colt's jaw clenched. He moved to the door, checked the lock, slid the bolt into place with a metallic click that sounded too loud in the quiet cabin. "You're staying," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Just tonight," Margaret started. "Long as the storm lasts." "I can't." "You can." Colt looked at her, and his eyes held something she hadn't expected. Certainty. "And you will." Margaret didn't sleep. Neither did Colt. They sat in the cabin's small light, listening to the wind and the occasional crack of the fire, not speaking much, because words felt less important than presence. Duke remained at the door, a silent sentinel, his amber eyes reflecting the flames. At some point, near dawn, Colt stood and moved to the mantel above the stove. He picked up a small framed photograph, old, edges softened from handling, and stared at it for a long time. Margaret couldn't see the picture clearly, but she saw the way Colt's shoulders tightened, the way his throat worked like he was swallowing something sharp. "Your mother?" she asked softly. Colt didn't look at her. Yeah. She looks kind. She was. The past tense landed heavy between them. I'm sorry, Margaret said. Colt set the photograph back down carefully, like it might break. She died while I was gone. I didn't make it back in time. Margaret felt the words settle into her bones. She knew that particular grief, the kind that came from absence, from missing the moment you couldn't get back. Where were you? She asked. Running, Colt said simply. From everything. Thought if I got far enough away it wouldn't follow. Did it work? No. He looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret saw something in his face she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror. The exhaustion of carrying grief alone. The weight of believing you didn't deserve comfort. You learned from the right fire, she said quietly. Colt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Maybe. Morning came pale and cold. Colt opened the door to let light in, and the world outside looked scrubbed clean, brutal and beautiful in the way only winter could manage. Margaret stood on the porch, wrapped in the blanket Colt had given her, and looked down at the town below. From this height, Pinewood Ridge looked peaceful, roofs white with snow, smoke rising from chimneys, everything small and manageable. But she knew better. She'd lived in that town for 40 years. She knew how easily people looked away when looking cost them something. There, she said, pointing toward a cluster of trees near the town's edge. The house with the cedar siding. You can't see the porch from here, but it's there. Colt followed her finger, said nothing. That was my whole world, Margaret added, not with sadness, with fact. Duke stood between them, head lifted, watching the town like he was memorizing it. They went back inside, and Colt poured coffee he didn't drink himself. Margaret wrapped her hands around the mug and felt the warmth seep into her palms. What will you do? Colt asked. I don't know, Margaret said honestly. Fight, maybe, if I knew how. You know how. I'm 78 years old and I've got $43 in my bank account. I don't know anything except how to lose. Colt set his own mug down. That's not true. What do you mean? You knocked on 7 doors last night, Colt said. Stayed standing in a blizzard that should have killed you. Kept your dog alive. Kept yourself alive. That's not losing. That's fighting. Margaret's eyes burned. Doesn't feel like it. It never does, Colt said quietly. But it is. By mid-morning, Margaret's cough had returned, dry, rattling, the kind that made her chest ache. Colt didn't ask permission. He just pulled on his coat, grabbed keys from a hook by the door, and nodded toward the truck parked beside the garage. We're going to town, he said. You don't have to, I know. Duke jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, turning once to check that Margaret was following. She climbed in slowly, every joint protesting, and Colt started the engine with a growl that sounded like the mountain itself waking up. The road down was narrow, carved into the slope decades ago and never quite improved. Colt drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, his eyes scanning the road ahead with a focus that felt automatic. Margaret watched him and wondered what he'd been running from. Who he'd lost besides his mother. Why a man who looked built for brotherhood had chosen to live alone on a mountain where even the trees looked lonely. What did you do? She asked. Before here. Colt's jaw tightened. Rode. With a club? Iron Ridge. Margaret knew the name. Everyone in Pinewood Ridge knew the name. The motorcycle club that used to run security for local events, that showed up when someone needed help moving or fixing a roof or standing between a bully and a victim. They'd had a reputation, rough, loud, loyal. "Why'd you leave?" she asked. Colt didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "My brother died. Club business. I wasn't there." "I'm sorry." "Yeah." They drove the rest of the way in silence. Pinewood Ridge looked different in daylight, smaller, quieter, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business and pretended not to. Colt parked outside the pharmacy, engine still running, and looked at Margaret. "Stay here, I'll be fast." He was gone before she could argue. Through the window, Margaret watched him move through the pharmacy aisles with purpose, picking up medicine and cough syrup like he'd done it 100 times before. At the counter, he paid cash, exchanged a few words with the clerk, and turned back toward the door. That's when he stopped. A man in a sheriff's deputy uniform stood near the entrance, hand raised in greeting. Colt's posture shifted, not hostile, but wary. They talked for maybe 30 seconds. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw the deputy's face, tired, concerned, the look of someone carrying more than a badge. She saw Colt nod once, short and final, and walk past him out the door. When he climbed back into the truck, Margaret asked, "Who was that?" "Connor Wren, deputy." "Friend?" "Used to be." Colt handed her the medicine, and Margaret held the bag like it was something precious. Across the street, the general store windows were plastered with flyers and handwritten signs. Colt's eyes lingered on one, a public notice about foreclosures, Summit Property Solutions logo printed clean and professional at the bottom. "They're everywhere," Margaret said quietly. Colt's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Yeah." He went into the general store alone, told Margaret to wait. She watched through the windshield as he disappeared inside, and then her attention caught on something else. A man, mid-30s, clean-cut, dark jacket over a gray hoodie. He stood near a shelf, hands in his pockets, not shopping, just watching. When Colt appeared at the far end of the aisle, the man turned, and Margaret saw his smile. Friendly, easy, the kind of smile that made you think of salesmen and politicians. She saw them talk, saw the man gesture toward the truck, saw Colt's face go still and cold. When Colt came back out, he was carrying a bag of supplies, but his jaw was locked tight. "Who was that?" Margaret asked. "Said his name was Silas." "What did he want?" "Said he was looking for an elderly woman who wandered off last night. Said he wanted to make sure she was safe." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "That you were." "And?" Colt started the engine. "And he said he was glad. Said he wouldn't want accidents." The way he said the word, accidents, made Margaret's blood go cold. Duke's ears flattened against his skull, and a low rumble started deep in his chest. Colt put the truck in gear and drove. Fast. Controlled, but fast. They didn't talk on the way back up the mountain. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold. When they reached the cabin, Colt carried the supplies inside and set them on the table with deliberate care. Then he moved to the window and stared out at the town below, and Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders, coiled, ready. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly. "No." "You should stay out of it." Colt turned to look at her, and his eyes were hard. "Little late for that." "I didn't mean to drag you into this." "You didn't drag me into anything," Colt said. "You knocked on my door. I opened it. That was my choice." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why did you open it? Why didn't you just let me freeze?" Colt looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because my mother died alone, and I wasn't there. And I've spent 2 years trying to forgive myself for that, and I don't know if I ever will. But I know," his jaw tightened, "I know I'm not going to stand by and watch someone else die alone when I can stop it." Margaret's eyes filled. She nodded once, unable to speak. Duke moved to the window and sat down, staring at the forest, at the places where the light had flickered the night before. Colt joined him. 2 centuries, 2 lives that had learned to survive by staying alert. And Margaret sat by the fire, holding the medicine that a stranger had bought for her, and thought about how salvation almost never looked the way you expected it to. The day bled into evening. Colt made soup again, more of it this time, and they ate without speaking much. The cabin felt smaller than it had the night before, crowded with the weight of things unsaid. Margaret coughed until her ribs hurt, and Colt handed her the medicine with a glass of water, watching until she swallowed. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once. Outside, the sky darkened fast, clouds rolling in heavy and low. Snow started to fall again, thick and relentless, the kind that buried roads and trapped people in their choices. Duke rose suddenly, ears forward, body tense. Colt moved to the window. Down the slope, visible through the trees, a dark truck sat parked on the access road. Engine off, lights off. Just sitting there. Margaret stood, legs shaking. "That's them." "How many?" "Usually 2, sometimes 3. Colt watched the truck for a full minute. It didn't move, didn't leave. Then, slowly, the headlights flicked on. Once, off again. On, off. Like a signal. Like a message. Duke let out a low, controlled sound that wasn't quite a bark, more like a vow. Colt stepped back from the window and crossed to the door. He checked the lock, checked the bolt, moved through the cabin with precision, closing curtains, securing anything that could be seen or used. When he was done, he sat down at the table and looked at Margaret. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "I'll bring you trouble." "You already did," Colt said, and his mouth twitched. "Might as well see it through." Margaret felt something break open inside her, something that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. She started to cry, and this time she didn't stop. Duke crossed to her and laid his head in her lap, and Colt sat across from her in the firelight, and neither of them said it would be okay, because they both knew better. But they stayed. And sometimes, Margaret thought, staying was the bravest thing anyone could do. Outside, the truck's engine started, idled for 10 seconds, then drove away. But Duke didn't relax. Colt didn't relax. They sat in the cabin's small light, 3 broken lives that had found each other in a blizzard, and waited for whatever came next. Because they all knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Morning brought no answers, only frost and the kind of silence that felt like held breath. Colt was awake before dawn. He'd never really slept, and when he stepped outside to split wood, the cold bit into his lungs like punishment. The truck from the night before had left tracks in the snow, deep grooves that led down the mountain and disappeared into the tree line. Someone had come close. Someone had watched. Someone had left. Duke followed him out, limping slightly in the cold, and immediately began circling the truck with his nose low to the ground. He stopped at the rear wheel well, sat down hard, and stared at Colt with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Colt's neck rise. "What is it?" Colt muttered, crouching down. He ran his hand along the undercarriage and felt it immediately. Small, magnetic, cold as death. A GPS tracker, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, tucked up against the frame where no one would see it unless they were looking. Colt's jaw clenched. He pulled it free, held it in his palm, and felt the weight of what it meant. They weren't just watching. They were hunting. He looked at Duke, and the dog's ears were flat against his skull, a low rumble building in his chest. "Yeah," Colt said quietly. "I know." He wrapped the tracker in a rag and carried it inside. Maggie was awake, sitting by the stove with her hands wrapped around a mug of water that had gone cold. Her face was pale, shadows carved deep beneath her eyes, and when she coughed, the sound rattled through her whole body. Colt set the tracker on the table in front of her. She stared at it. "What is that?" "They put it on my truck last night." Maggie's hands started to shake. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "Stop." Colt's voice was firm, but not harsh. "You didn't do this. They did." "But I brought it here. I brought them to your door." "No." Colt sat down across from her, leaning forward, making sure she heard him. "You didn't bring them here. You survived. There's a difference." Maggie's eyes filled, and she looked away, ashamed of the tears she couldn't control. Colt stood. "Get your coat. We're going to town." "I can't. You're coughing blood, Maggie. I saw it on the rag this morning. You need a doctor." She opened her mouth to argue, but the truth was written all over her face. She was getting worse. They both knew it. Duke pressed against her leg, and she buried her hand in his fur like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Okay," she whispered. The drive down the mountain felt different this time, heavier. Colt kept checking the rearview mirror, watching for vehicles that stayed too close or followed too far behind. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his pulse was military sharp, counting seconds, calculating exits, preparing for violence he hoped wouldn't come. Maggie stared out the window at the town below, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, Colt almost didn't hear her. "I used to love this place." Colt glanced at her. "What changed?" "I got old. I got poor. I stopped being useful." "That's not how it works. Isn't it?" Maggie turned to look at him, and her eyes were fierce despite the exhaustion. "You think anyone down there cares that I paid my mortgage for 43 years? That I volunteered at the library? That I brought casseroles to every funeral? That I knew everyone's kids' names?" Colt said nothing. "The second I couldn't pay," Maggie continued, "I stopped being a neighbor. I became a problem. And problems get removed." Colt's jaw tightened. He'd seen it before. Different uniforms, different countries, same ugly truth. The world only valued you as long as you could serve it. "Summit Property Solutions," he said. "How'd you end up with them?" Maggie sighed. "Storm took the roof. Insurance covered half. I needed $12,000 to fix it properly. Bank said no. Fixed income, age, risk. Then this man called. Said his company specialized in helping seniors. Low interest, flexible terms, no credit check required." "What was his name?" "Garrett Kane." Colt filed the name away. "And the terms?" 6% interest. Manageable. Or so I thought. Maggie's voice went hard. 3 months later, I got a letter saying the rate had adjusted to 14%. Called the company. They said I'd agreed to a variable rate in the contract. "Did you?" "I don't know." Maggie's hands twisted in her lap. "Maybe. I didn't understand half of what I was signing. They kept saying it was standard, that everyone signed the same thing." Colt felt the familiar burn of rage building in his chest. Controlled, cold, the kind that didn't explode, but instead settled into your bones and waited. How much do you owe now? $42,000. On a $12,000 loan? Penalties, fees, late payments I didn't know were late because the due dates kept changing. Maggie coughed, hard, and Colt saw the blood on her hand when she pulled it away from her mouth. He pressed the accelerator harder. The clinic sat on the edge of Pinewood Ridge's Main Street, a small brick building with a faded sign that read, Dr. Morrison, Family Practice. Colt parked out front, and Duke jumped out first, scanning the street with the same focused intensity he'd shown at the cabin. Inside, the waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. A young woman at the desk looked up, smiled automatically, then saw Maggie's face, and the smile dropped. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Colt said, "but she needs to be seen now." The woman looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Colt's tone made her reconsider. "Let me get Dr. Morrison." They waited. Duke sat at Maggie's feet, head resting on her knee, and she stroked his ears with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered to Colt. "Don't. I mean it." "I know." Colt's voice was quiet. "But you don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do. You could have left me out there. Most people would have." Colt looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something break open in his face. Grief, raw and unhealed. "My mother died in a hospital room in Billings while I was 800 miles away, riding through Nebraska on a bike that meant nothing. I got the call at a gas station. Didn't even make it back for the funeral." His jaw worked. "So, no, Maggie. I couldn't have left you out there." Maggie reached out and touched his hand, just once, quick, and Colt didn't pull away. The doctor emerged then, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes. She took one look at Maggie and nodded toward the back. "Come with me." Colt waited in the parking lot, leaning against the truck with his arms crossed, watching the street. Duke sat beside him, alert, scanning every car that passed. That's when he saw her. Deputy Sarah Chen pulled into the lot in an unmarked sedan, and when she stepped out, Colt recognized her immediately. She was younger than he remembered, early 30s maybe, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail and sharp eyes that took in everything before she opened her mouth. She walked over slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "Colt Mercer," she said. "Deputy?" "It's just Sarah." She stopped a few feet away, giving him space. "I heard you were back in the area." "Passing through." Sarah's mouth twitched. "Sure you are." She glanced at Duke. "That's not your dog." "No." "Who's the woman?" Colt's eyes went flat. "Why are you asking?" Sarah held up her hands. "Because I'm trying to help, Colt. I've been watching Summit Property Solutions for 6 months. Something's not right with their operation, but every time I get close, someone higher up tells me to back off." Colt studied her. "Why tell me?" "Because you're not the backing off type." Sarah pulled a small notebook from her pocket and flipped it open. 17 foreclosures in the last year, all elderly homeowners, all with Summit loans. 5 of those houses are sitting empty now. No resale, no rental, just empty. What are they using them for? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Sarah looked at him directly. If you're helping Margaret Brennan, and I think you are, you need to know these people don't play fair. They've got lawyers, connections, and a very long reach. Is that a warning? That's a fact. Sarah closed the notebook. But if you find something I can use, something that'll hold up in court, I'll make sure it gets to the right people. Colt nodded once. I'll think about it. Don't think too long, Sarah said. People are getting hurt. She walked back to her car, and Colt watched her drive away, filing every word she'd said into the part of his brain that still worked like a soldier's. Duke whined softly. Yeah, Colt muttered. I don't trust her either, but we might not have a choice. The doctor kept Maggie for an hour. When she finally came out, her face was drawn, and she moved like every step hurt. Pneumonia, she said, before Colt could ask. Early stage. She gave me antibiotics, told me to rest, stay warm, avoid stress. The old garage sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. It was a low, sprawling building with rusted siding and a hand-painted sign that read, A long table sat in the center with chairs that had held men who'd been brothers, who'd bled together, who'd buried their dead together. Colt walked through the space slowly, trailing his fingers along workbenches, and Maggie stayed quiet, understanding that some places were sacred in ways words couldn't touch. He stopped at a photograph on the wall. Group shot, maybe 15 men, all wearing their vests with the Iron Ridge patch sewn on. Colt was there, younger, harder, standing next to a man who looked so much like him they could have been twins. Reese, Colt said quietly. Your brother, Maggie said. Yeah. What happened to him? Colt stared at the photograph. Territorial dispute. Club from Billings thought we were moving on their routes. We weren't. But they didn't care about facts. They cared about power. His jaw clenched. Reese was trying to broker peace. Met them alone because he thought talking was braver than fighting. And they shot him in a parking lot and left him there. Maggie's breath caught. I'm sorry. I was on the other side of the state when it happened. Colt continued, voice flat. By the time I got back, he was already in the ground. Mom never recovered. Stopped eating, stopped talking, just faded. He turned away from the photograph. I thought if I left, if I got away from the club and the violence and the memories, maybe I could breathe again. Did it work? Colt looked at her. No. The door opened behind them, and Colt spun, body coiled, ready, and then he stopped. The man in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, with long hair pulled into a bun and a beard that was more silver than black now. He wore a leather vest with the Iron Ridge patch sewn over his heart, and when he saw Colt, his entire face cracked open into something between grief and joy. Brother, the man said, voice rough. Colt's throat worked. Jackson Reeves crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled Colt into a hug so tight Maggie heard the air leave Colt's lungs. Colt stood rigid for a second. Then his arms came up and he held on like a man drowning. When they pulled apart, Jax gripped Colt's shoulders and stared at him like he was making sure he was real. 2 years, Jax said. 2 years, you bastard. No calls, no letters, nothing. I know. We looked for you. I didn't want to be found. Yeah, well. Jax's eyes were bright. Tough. Colt's mouth twitched. Still bossy. Still stupid, Jax shot back. But there was no heat in it. Only love. His eyes shifted to Maggie, and his expression softened. Ma'am? Maggie Brennan, she said. Jax looked between them, reading the situation the way only someone who'd spent years in a brotherhood could. You in trouble? Some, Colt said. How much? Enough. Jax's jaw set. Then we handle it. No, Colt's voice was firm. This isn't club business. You are club business, Jax said, and there was steel in his tone now. You left, Colt. Fine. We respected that. But you don't get to come back into our territory and fight alone. That's not how this works. Jax? No. Jax stepped closer. Reese died because he went alone. Do you think I'm going to stand by and watch you make the same mistake? The words landed like a punch, and Colt flinched. Maggie saw it. Saw the wound open. Saw Colt's breath go shallow. "That's not fair," Colt said quietly. "No," Jax agreed. "It's not. But it's true." They stared at each other, and the silence stretched tight enough to snap. Finally, Colt exhaled. "Summit Property Solutions. Real estate operation. They're targeting elderly homeowners. Predatory loans, forged documents, intimidation." Jax's expression went cold. "They touch anyone else?" "At least 17 in the last year, according to a deputy I talked to." "Names?" "I don't have them yet." "We'll get them." Jax pulled out his phone. "I'll make some calls. We've got guys who know guys. Someone's seen something." Maggie spoke up, her voice hesitant. "You don't have to do this. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of me." Jax looked at her, and his face softened again. "Ma'am, with all respect, this stopped being about you the second they came after one of ours." He nodded toward Colt. "He's my brother. That makes you family. And we protect family." Maggie's eyes filled, and she nodded, unable to speak. Duke moved to her side, and Jax crouched down, extending a hand slowly. Duke sniffed it, then allowed the touch, and Jax's grin was genuine. "Good dog," he said. "Smart dog." "He was search and rescue," Maggie said. "Before the fire." "Explains the awareness." Jax stood. "You staying up at the cabin?" "For now," Colt said. "Good. Remote. Defensible." Jax pulled a card from his wallet and handed it to Colt. "That's my direct line. You see anything, you call. Don't wait. Don't think you can handle it alone." Colt took the card. "I'm not bringing the club into a war." "Then don't start one," Jax said simply. "But if someone else does, we finish it." The weight of those words settled over all of them, and Maggie felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the bright, naive kind, the gritty, determined kind that survived. Colt helped Maggie inside, settled her near the stove, and made her take the antibiotics with hot tea. She fell asleep quickly, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. Colt sat by the window, watching the tree line, and Duke joined him. They sat in silence, 2 sentries keeping watch, and when the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Colt thought about his brother, thought about his mother, thought about all the ways grief, legal language that made Maggie's hands shake when she tried to read them, accusations of trespass, fraud, willful abandonment of property. They painted her as a criminal, and the words sat heavy in the cabin like smoke that wouldn't clear. Colt read them aloud while Maggie sat by the stove, wrapped in blankets, coughing into a rag she tried to hide from him. He didn't comment on the blood, just kept reading, his voice flat and controlled, committing every word to memory. "They're suing you," he said finally. "Civil suit, claiming damages for unpaid debt and property misuse." "How much?" $73,000. Maggie's face went gray. "I don't have $73. "They know that." Colt set the papers down. "This isn't about money. It's about pressure. They want you scared." "It's working." Duke lifted his head from where he'd been lying at her feet, ears twitching toward the window. Colt's attention snapped that direction instantly, body coiling, but the tree line stayed empty. The dog settled again, but the warning had been clear. Something was coming. They just didn't know when. Jax called that night, voice tight. "We found her. Elena Martinez. Blogger out of Missoula, moved here 6 months ago. She's been tracking Summit for a while. Her grandmother got hit by them in Flathead County." "She willing to talk?" Colt asked. "More than willing. She's been waiting for someone to fight back. Jax paused. But, Colt, she's getting heat. Someone broke into her apartment last week. Didn't take anything, just moved things around. Message. Colt's jaw clenched. Where is she now? Staying with friends. I'll set up a meet. Do it. Elena Martinez didn't look like someone who scared easily. She was small, maybe 5'3", with dark hair pulled into a messy bun and eyes that burned with the kind of anger that came from watching people you loved get hurt. She met them at a diner on the edge of town, sliding into the booth across from Colt with a laptop bag and a manila folder thick enough to be a weapon. You're Mercer, she said, not a question. Yeah. And you're helping Margaret Brennan? Trying to. Elena's eyes shifted to Maggie, who sat beside Colt looking frailer than she had that morning. Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry for what they did to you. Not your fault, Maggie said quietly. No, but I should have written about it sooner. Should have pushed harder. Elena opened the folder and spread documents across the table. Summit Property Solutions is owned by a holding company called North Point Ventures. Garrett Kane is the public face, but the real money comes from somewhere else. I haven't figured out where yet. Colt studied the papers. Contracts, foreclosure notices, property transfers, all following the same pattern. How many? That I can prove? 23 families in the last 18 months. Elderly, fixed income, all of them borrowed for emergency repairs. Elena's voice went hard. The loans start reasonable. 6-7% interest. Then the terms change. Rates jump to 14-16%. Payment schedules shift. Late fees stack up so fast people can't keep track. That's illegal, Maggie said. Only if you can prove they didn't disclose it. Elena pulled out another document. Look at this contract. Page 7, paragraph 12, subsection C. Hidden in the middle of legal jargon. Lender reserves the right to adjust interest rates based on market conditions with written notice to borrower. Most people never see it, and if they do, they don't understand it. Colt's hands tightened on the table. What happens to the houses after foreclosure? That's the strange part, Elena said. They don't resell. They sit empty, sometimes for months. Then suddenly there's activity, trucks coming and going, lights on at odd hours, and then nothing again. Storage, Colt said, or staging ground. Elena met his eyes. Deputy Chen thinks they're moving something through these properties. Maybe drugs, maybe stolen goods, maybe people. She can't get close enough to prove it. Maggie's cough turned violent, and she pressed the rag to her mouth. When she pulled it away, the blood was bright and fresh. Colt's chest tightened. We need to get you back to the doctor. I'm fine. You're not. I'll rest when this is over. Maggie's voice was steel wrapped in exhaustion. What do we do with this information? Elena leaned forward. We go public. Town hall meeting is scheduled for next week. I present the evidence, Deputy Chen backs it up with official documentation. You tell your story. She looked at Colt. And you stand beside her so they know she's not alone. They'll fight back, Colt said. Let them. Elena's smile was sharp. I've got a platform with 40,000 followers and 3 news outlets that want this story. Let's see how tough Summit Property Solutions is when the whole state is watching. The power went out 2 nights later, during the worst blizzard Colt had seen in years. Not a flicker, not a surge, just sudden, complete darkness and the immediate death of the heater's hum. The cabin went silent, except for the wind screaming against the walls like something alive and furious. Colt was on his feet instantly, flashlight in hand, moving to the circuit breaker. He checked every switch, but nothing had tripped. The line had been cut. Someone had come up the mountain in a blizzard and killed his power deliberately. Duke was at the door, hackles raised, a sound building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, but held the same warning. "Stay with Maggie," Colt ordered, pulling on his coat. "Colt, don't," Maggie started, but he was already out the door. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath, but he pushed through it, flashlight beam cutting through snow that fell so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. He found the main line 50 yards from the cabin, hanging limp where it had been severed clean. Not weather damage. Wire cutters. His heart rate stayed controlled, but his mind was racing through options. They were trapped up here. No power meant no heat. Maggie was already sick. If they stayed, she might not survive the night. If they tried to drive down in this storm, they might not make it to the main road. He was weighing those options when Duke's bark cut through the wind, sharp, urgent. Not the warning bark, but the alert bark. Something found. Colt ran back to the cabin. Duke was behind it, pawing at the snow near the old storage shed, and when Colt shone the flashlight down, his blood went cold. A metal canister, half buried, with wiring running from it toward the shed's wooden foundation. A scent. Enough to turn the shed into an inferno, and the shed was close enough to the cabin that if it went up, everything went up. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was murder dressed up as an accident. Colt grabbed his phone, hands shaking from cold and rage, and called Jax. "They just tried to burn us out," he said when Jax answered. "Get up here, now!" Jax arrived with 4 other Iron Ridge members, their bikes roaring up the mountain road despite the snow and ice. They brought generators, space heaters, and a determination that felt like armor. While 2 members worked on restoring temporary power, Jax helped Colt dismantle the incendiary device with the careful precision of men who'd handled worse in darker places. When it was done, they stood in the snow, breath fogging, and Jax's face was carved from granite. "This is escalation," he said. "I know." "We can't wait for a town hall meeting, Colt. They're trying to kill her. They're trying to kill you." "I know that too." Jax grabbed his shoulder. "Then let us help. Really help, not just backup, full support. The club stands with you." Colt looked at the men around him, brothers he'd abandoned 2 years ago, brothers who'd come anyway when he called. He thought about Reese, about going alone, about how pride and grief had nearly destroyed him. "Okay," he said finally. "But we do this smart, legal, no retaliation that gives them ammunition." "Agreed," Jack said. "But we protect what's ours. And right now that old woman in your cabin and that dog are ours. You got me?" "Yeah," Colt said. "I got you." They moved Maggie to a safe house the next morning, a place owned by one of the club members' families deep in the woods, off any map Summit might have. She protested weakly, but her fever was climbing, her breathing labored, and when Colt carried her to the truck, she weighed almost nothing. Duke rode in the back, never taking his eyes off her. At the safe house, a retired nurse named Beth took one look at Maggie and shook her head. "Hospital. Now." "No hospitals," Maggie whispered. "They'll find me. They'll find your body if you don't get treated," Beth said bluntly but kindly. "That pneumonia is winning, honey. Antibiotics aren't enough anymore." Colt knelt beside the couch where they'd laid her. "Maggie, you have to go." "I can't afford—" "I'll cover it." "Colt." "This isn't a debate." His voice was gentle but absolute. "You came to my door because you wanted to survive. So survive. Let me help you survive." Maggie's eyes filled. She nodded once, too weak to fight anymore. They took her to the hospital in Kalispell, an hour away, where Summit's reach was thinner. Colt stayed in the waiting room while they admitted her, and Duke lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes never closing. Jax brought coffee and sat beside him. "She gonna make it?" "Doctor says maybe. 50-50. "Tough odds. She's a tough woman." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hospital's mechanical hum, the distant beeping of monitors, the quiet conversations of people living through the worst days of their lives. "I need to tell you something," Colt said, finally. Jax waited. "After Reese died, I blamed myself. Thought if I'd been there, I could have stopped it. Thought if I'd been better, stronger, faster, he'd still be alive." Colt's voice cracked. "And when Mom died, I blamed myself for that, too. For leaving, for running, for choosing the road over her." "Colt, let me finish." Colt looked at him. "I came up that mountain to die. Not fast, just slow, alone. I thought that's what I deserved. And then this old woman knocked on my door with her dog, and I didn't want to answer. I wanted to let her freeze because that was easier than caring again." Jax's throat worked. "But I couldn't," Colt continued. "Something in me couldn't." "And now she's in there fighting for her life. And I don't know if I saved her or just delayed the inevitable. But I know one thing." He met Jax's eyes. "I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens, I stay. I fight. And if Summit wants a war, they're going to get one they never saw coming." Jax gripped his shoulder hard. "Then let's give it to them." The plan came together fast. Elena would publish her article 2 days before the town hall meeting, building pressure. Deputy Chen would file formal complaints with the state attorney general, forcing an investigation. And Colt would do what he did best: go into the dark places and drag the truth out by its throat. Maggie's old house was the key. If Summit was using foreclosed properties for illegal activity, evidence would be there. They just had to get it before it disappeared. Colt and Jax scouted the location at dusk, watching from the tree line. The house looked abandoned, windows dark, no vehicles, no movement. But Duke had come with them, and the dog's body language told a different story. He was tense, focused, tracking something they couldn't see. "He smells something," Colt murmured. "What?" "Don't know, but he doesn't like it." They waited until full dark, then moved in. The back door was locked, but Jax had the tools, and within 30 seconds they were inside. The house was cold, smelled like mold and abandonment, but Duke went straight to the basement door and sat down hard. Colt opened it. The stairs descended into darkness that felt heavier than it should. He pulled out his flashlight and started down, Jax behind him, Duke leading. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed beams, old furniture stacked in corners. But against the far wall was something that didn't belong. A new door, metal, with a commercial-grade lock. "That's not original," Jax said. Colt examined the lock. "Industrial. Expensive. They didn't want anyone getting in here. Or out." They forced it open, and the smell hit them first. Chemical. Sharp. Wrong. Inside was a narrow room lined with metal shelving, and on those shelves sat rows of cardboard boxes, each labeled with codes that meant nothing to Colt, but everything to someone. Jax opened one. Inside were smaller packages, vacuum-sealed, white powder visible through the plastic. "Jesus," he breathed. "They're using foreclosed houses as distribution points," Colt said, mind racing. "Move product in, stage it, move it out. Old people's homes no one's watching anymore." Duke whined, pawing at a box in the corner. Colt opened it and found documents, ledgers, transaction records, names, dates, amounts. A paper trail Summit had been stupid or arrogant enough to leave behind. "We need to call Chen," Colt said. "Now." He was reaching for his phone when they heard it. Voices upstairs, heavy footsteps, the front door opening. Jax and Colt locked eyes. They were trapped. Duke's ears went flat, and a growl built in his chest, low and dangerous. Colt grabbed the dog's collar, holding him silent, and pressed himself against the wall. Jax moved to the opposite side, both of them falling into the old patterns of combat without thinking. The footsteps came closer. 2 men, maybe 3, moving through the house with the confidence of people who thought they owned it. Colt heard their voices now, casual, unconcerned. "Kane wants this cleared out tonight. State cops are sniffing around." "How much we got left?" 6 boxes, maybe 7. Should be able to move it in one trip." They were coming to the basement. Colt's mind ran through scenarios. They were outnumbered, trapped in a confined space with no legal standing for being here. If this turned violent, Summit would paint them as criminals, and everything they'd built would collapse. But if they let these men walk out with the evidence, Maggie's case died. Elena's article meant nothing. The whole thing disappeared. The basement's door opened. Light spilled down the stairs. "Grab the boxes from the locked room," a voice called down. "I'll pull the truck around." One set of footsteps descended. Colt saw the flashlight beam before he saw the man. 30s, heavy build, wearing a jacket with Summit's logo on it. The man stepped into the room, saw the open boxes, and froze. Then he saw Colt. For one stretched second, nobody moved. Then the man lunged for his phone, and Colt had no choice. He crossed the space in 2 strides and slammed the man against the wall, one hand over his mouth, the other controlling his arms. "Don't," Colt said quietly. "Don't make this worse." The man struggled, and Jax moved in, zip-tying his wrists with practiced efficiency. They had maybe 30 seconds before the second man came looking. Duke was vibrating with controlled violence, waiting for the command to release, but Colt kept him locked down. They needed evidence, not bloodshed. The second man called down the stairs. "Kenny, you good?" Colt looked at Jax, made a decision. "Answer him," he told Kenny. "Say you're coming. Say it normal." Kenny's eyes were wild, but he nodded. Colt slowly removed his hand. "Yeah," Kenny called up. "Just grabbing the last box." "Hurry up. I want to be out of here before midnight." Colt waited, counting seconds, then dragged Kenny to the corner and secured him to a support beam. He pulled out his phone and texted Deputy Chen a single word. "Now." Then he added the address. Jax was already photographing everything: the boxes, the ledgers, the locked room, Kenny's face. Evidence Summit couldn't make disappear. Footsteps on the stairs again. "Kenny, what the hell is taking—" The second man appeared in the doorway, and Duke moved, not attacking, but placing himself between the man and Colt, teeth bared, a sound coming from him that made the man go pale. "Don't move," Colt said. "Hands where I can see them." The man was smarter than Kenny. He raised his hands slowly, eyes on Duke, and didn't argue when Jax zip-tied him and dragged him to the opposite wall. "Who you work for?" Colt asked. Silence. "Garrett Kane?" The man's jaw tightened. Answer enough. "How many houses?" "Lawyer," the man said. Just that one word. Colt nodded. He'd expected nothing else. These weren't scared kids. These were professionals who knew the game. Sirens cut through the night, distant, but getting closer. "That's our cue," Jax said. They left the way they'd come, slipping into the tree line before Deputy Chen's vehicle pulled up, lights flashing. Colt watched from cover as she entered the house. As backup arrived, as the two men were dragged out in handcuffs. Duke pressed against his leg, and Colt's hand dropped to the dog's head. "Good boy," he murmured. "Good boy." The town hall meeting 3 days later was packed. People Colt had never seen. People who'd lived in Pinewood Ridge their whole lives. People who'd been touched by Summit and stayed quiet because they thought they had no choice. Elena stood at the front with Deputy Chen, and when she started speaking, laying out the evidence, showing the documents, naming names, the room went silent in a way that felt like a held breath. Maggie was there, released from the hospital against doctor's orders, sitting in the front row wrapped in blankets, pale but present. When Elena called her name, she stood, and the whole room stood with her. And in the back, Colt stood between Jax and 4 other Iron Ridge members, a wall of leather and loyalty that made Summit's lawyers sweat. Garrett Kane tried to speak, tried to deny, tried to spin. But the truth was louder. The arrests came that night. Kane, 3 of his employees, and 2 town officials who'd been taking bribes. Federal charges. Conspiracy, racketeering, drug trafficking. Colt sat on his porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over Pinewood Ridge, and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but enough. Duke lay at his feet, and Maggie sat beside him, breathing easier now, and Jax's bike was parked in the driveway because brothers didn't leave brothers to face the morning alone. "Thank you," Maggie said quietly. Colt shook his head. "You saved yourself." "No," she said. "You opened the door. That's what saved me." And maybe, Colt thought, that's what saved them both. The federal agents arrived before the sun was fully up, 3 black SUVs rolling through Pinewood Ridge like judgment itself. Colt watched from the diner window, coffee going cold in his hands, as men in windbreakers with FBI printed across the back entered the county courthouse. Jax sat across from him, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Think they'll actually do something?" Jax asked. "They already did," Colt said. "Kane's in custody. That's more than we had yesterday." "Custody isn't conviction." "No, but it's a start." Maggie pushed her eggs around her plate, barely eating, and Colt noticed the tremor in her hands had returned. Not from cold this time, from the weight of what came next. Victory didn't feel like the stories promised. It felt exhausting, uncertain, like standing on ice that might crack at any second. "What happens to my house?" she asked quietly. Colt met her eyes. "We get it back." "How? The foreclosure went through. The paperwork's done." "Paperwork signed under fraud is void," Deputy Chen said, sliding into the booth beside them. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, hair pulled back severely, eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "Federal prosecutor I talked to this morning says they're freezing all of Summit's assets pending investigation. That includes your property deed." Maggie's breath caught. "How long?" "Could be weeks, could be months, but they're fast-tracking cases involving elderly victims and criminal enterprise." Chen pulled out a folder. "I need you to sign a statement. Everything that happened, from the first loan to the attempted arson. Can you do that?" Maggie's hand shook as she reached for the pen. "Will it be enough? Combined with what we found in that basement? Yeah, it'll be enough." The pen scratched across paper, and Colt watched Maggie's face, the way her jaw tightened with each signature, the way her eyes stayed dry despite the tears he knew she was holding back. Strength didn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looked like an old woman signing her name on a legal document, while her whole world hung in the balance. Duke sat at her feet, head resting on her knee, and when she finished signing, she dropped her hand into his fur like it was the only anchor keeping her from floating away. "What about the others?" Jax asked Chen. Elena said there were 23 families. 37, Chen corrected. We found more records in Kane's office, some going back 3 years. The number landed heavy. 37 families. 37 lives destroyed by greed wrapped in paperwork. They coming forward? Colt asked. Some are. Some are too scared. Some are already gone. Moved away, died, gave up. Chen's voice went hard. But enough for talking that the prosecutor's building a class action case. If it goes through, everyone gets restitution. If, Maggie repeated softly. When, Colt said, and his voice carried a certainty that made her look up. When it goes through, because we're not done fighting. The first volunteer showed up at Maggie's house 3 days later. His name was Frank Holloway, 74, wearing work gloves that had seen better decades and carrying a toolbox that weighed more than most men could lift. He stood in the overgrown yard and looked at Colt with eyes that had buried too many hopes. Heard you're fixing this place up, Frank said. Colt nodded. That's the plan. Heard you could use help. You know Maggie? No, but Summit took my sister's place in Kalispell 2 years ago. She died in a shelter last winter. Frank's jaw worked. So, yeah, I'll help. By noon, there were 6 more. By evening, 12. People Colt had never met, people who'd heard the story through the town's invisible network, people who'd been hurt by Summit or knew someone who had. They brought tools, materials, sandwiches wrapped in foil, thermoses of coffee. They brought their grief and their rage, and they turned both into something useful. Jax pulled up on his bike at dusk with 3 more Iron Ridge members, and when they dismounted, they weren't wearing their cuts, just work clothes and determined expressions. Club's backing this officially, Jax told Colt. Not as bikers, as neighbors. Colt felt something crack open in his chest. You don't have to. Yeah, we do. Jax handed him a sledgehammer. Reese would have been the first one here, so we're here for him. The name hung between them, and Colt took the hammer, feeling its weight settle into his palms like memory. They worked until the light failed, tearing out water-damaged drywall, pulling up rotted floorboards, marking everything that needed replacing. Maggie watched from a folding chair someone had brought, wrapped in blankets, coughing less now, but still fragile. Duke stayed at her side, and every time a new volunteer arrived, the dog would lift his head, assess them, then settle again. Guard duty never ended, even in daylight. When they finally stopped for the night, Frank Holloway approached Colt with a handshake that lasted longer than words needed to. Thank you, Frank said. I didn't do anything yet. You showed up. That's more than most. The rebuild took 3 weeks. Every morning, volunteers arrived before sunrise. Every evening, they left after dark. Colt worked alongside them, swinging a hammer with the same focused intensity he'd once applied to survival, and discovered that building was harder than destroying. Required more patience, more hope, more belief that what you created might actually last. He worked next to Jax most days, and they fell into the rhythm they'd had years ago. Jax talking, Colt listening, both of them communicating more through motion than words. They replaced the porch railing together, cutting and measuring and fitting pieces that would hold weight, that would last through winters and storms and time. You remember when we built that ramp for Mrs. Chen's mother? Jax asked one afternoon, voice casual but loaded with memory. Yeah. Reese measured everything 3 times because he didn't trust his first numbers. Drove us crazy. Jax smiled. But that ramp never wobbled. Not once. Colt's throat tightened. He was careful. He was thorough. There's a difference. Jax looked at him. You're like him that way. You measure everything before you commit. Didn't measure this. Bullshit. You measured Maggie the second she knocked on your door. Measured the cost, the risk, the outcome. You just didn't like what the math told you, so you did it anyway. Colt drove a nail home harder than necessary. That's supposed to mean something? Means you're still my brother. Means I'm glad you came back, even if you didn't mean to. They worked in silence after that, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that came from years of knowing someone's edges and choosing to stay close anyway. Duke's story came out one evening when they were working late, lights strung up so they could see, the sound of hammers and saws creating a rhythm that felt almost sacred. One of the volunteers, a younger guy named Marcus, who'd been quiet most days, was watching Duke with an expression Colt recognized. Loss, trying to wear a neutral face. "That's a working dog," Marcus said. "Was," Maggie replied from a chair. "Retired now." "What was his specialty?" "Search and rescue. Fire department." Marcus crouched down, extended his hand slowly, and Duke sniffed it before allowing the touch. "I had a partner like him. Afghanistan. IED detection. Best nose in the unit." "What happened to him?" Maggie asked gently. "Stepped on a pressure plate, saving my life. Took the blast that was meant for me." Marcus's voice stayed steady, but his eyes told a different story. "I think about him every day." Duke leaned into the touch, and Marcus's hand trembled as it moved through the dog's thick fur. "Duke had a partner too," Maggie said. "Young firefighter named Chris Denton. They'd been together 4 years when the warehouse fire happened. Chris went in after Duke when Duke wouldn't come out. There was a man trapped in the back, and Duke wouldn't leave him. Chris got them both out, but the roof came down on his way." Her voice cracked. "Duke tried to go back in for him. Took 3 men to hold him. He wore that burned harness strap for 2 years before I convinced him it was okay to let it go." Marcus's face crumpled, and he pressed his forehead against Duke's, and the dog held still, bearing the weight of someone else's grief, the way he'd been bearing Maggie's for years. Colt turned away, throat burning, and found himself staring at his mother's photograph on the mantel he'd moved from the cabin to Maggie's house. Looking at it didn't hurt the way it used to. The grief was still there, but it had company now. Other losses, other survivals, other people carrying weight they didn't choose but refused to put down. Jax appeared beside him. "You good?" "Getting there. That's all any of us can do." The Harley restoration started almost by accident. Colt had been avoiding the garage at the Iron Ridge clubhouse, avoiding the bike that had sat under a tarp for 2 years. But one afternoon, Jax dragged him there with an excuse about needing parts for Maggie's house project. The tarp came off, and dust rose in the light streaming through grimy windows. And there it was, his 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, black and chrome, customized over years of riding, carrying more memories than metal had any right to hold. "She's been waiting," Jax said quietly. Colt ran his hand along the fuel tank, fingers tracing scratches he remembered earning, dents that told stories he'd tried to forget. "I don't know if I can." "Can what? Ride again? Or remember why you loved it?" "Both." Jax pulled 2 beers from a cooler that hadn't been there a second ago, handed one to Colt, and sat down on a work stool. "After Reese died, I didn't ride for 6 months. Couldn't. Every time I threw my leg over the seat, I'd see him riding next to me, and it would break something in my chest I didn't think could break anymore." "What changed?" "His mom, your mom, asked me to take her somewhere. Said she needed to feel the wind, needed to remember what it was like when her boys were whole." Jax's voice roughened. "So I took her. And halfway there, she leaned forward and said, 'He'd be so pissed at you for stopping.' Don't give death that much power. Colt swallowed hard. So we brought the bike out here, Jax continued. And we're going to fix her up. New fluids, new cables, tune the engine, make her sing again. And when she's ready, you're going to ride her. Not for Reese, not for your mom. For you. Because living is the best revenge against everything that tried to kill you. They worked on the bike for hours that night, hands moving through old patterns, muscle memory stronger than grief. Jax told stories while they worked. Rides they'd taken, roads they'd conquered, nights that had turned into mornings without anyone noticing. Colt listened and felt something in him unclenching. Some fist that had been locked tight for 2 years, finally opening. When the engine turned over on the first try, the sound was thunder and healing and homecoming all at once. Jax grinned, wide and genuine. There she is. Colt sat on the bike, hands on the grips, and for the first time in years, he could see a road ahead that didn't look like running away. Deputy Sarah Chen's commendation ceremony happened on a cold Tuesday that felt more like punishment than celebration. The county sheriff handed her a plaque and shook her hand, while photographers from the local paper captured the moment. But Chen's face stayed carefully neutral, professional. Colt stood in the back of the room with Jax and watched her accept recognition for work that had nearly cost her career. Afterward, in the parking lot, she found them. "Thanks for coming," she said. "You earned it," Colt replied. "I did my job. That shouldn't require an award." "No, but it shouldn't require courage either. And it did." Chen's mouth twitched. "Garrett Kane's lawyer is already trying to suppress evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure, saying you and I colluded to frame his client." "Will it work?" "Not a chance. We've got 37 victims willing to testify, physical evidence from multiple sites, and Kane's own ledgers. But he'll drag it out, try to exhaust people into settling." She looked at Colt directly. "How's Margaret?" "Stronger every day." "Good. Because when this goes to trial, they're going to come after her. Make her look incompetent, irresponsible, like she deserved what happened." Colt's jaw clenched. "Let them try." Chen smiled, and it was sharp as winter. "That's what I thought you'd say. For what it's worth, I'm running for sheriff next year, and my platform is going to be community protection over property rights. No more looking the other way when companies like Summit operate in our county." "You'll win," Jax said. "People are tired of losing their homes." "We'll see." Chen extended her hand to Colt. "Thank you for not letting this go." Colt shook it. "Thank Maggie. She's the one who kept fighting when it would have been easier to disappear." Elena's article went viral 3 days later. Not local viral, national. The New York Times picked it up. CNN ran a segment. Suddenly, Pinewood Ridge was famous for all the wrong reasons, and people who'd never heard of Summit Property Solutions were learning exactly how corporations destroyed lives with paperwork and patience. Elena called Colt at 2 a.m, voice shaking with exhaustion and triumph. "We're getting calls from victims in 6 states, she said. "Same pattern, same company. They've been doing this for years, and nobody connected the dots because the victims were spread out, isolated, easy to dismiss." "How many?" "So far, over 100. And that's just the people willing to come forward." Colt closed his eyes. "Jesus." "The prosecutor's talking federal RICO charges now. Racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy. If they can make it stick, Kane and everyone above him goes away for 20 years minimum." "If," "When?" Elena said, and her voice carried the same fierce certainty Colt had used with Maggie. "When it sticks. Because we have you, and Maggie, and Duke, and every single person who refused to stay silent. That's not a case. That's a movement." After she hung up, Colt sat in the dark cabin, which felt less like a tomb now and more like a way station, and thought about movements. About how they started with one person refusing to freeze to death on a mountain. About how they grew when other people decided standing together was safer than hiding alone. The roof went on Maggie's house during the first warm day of early spring. Volunteers formed a line passing shingles up, working together like a body with many hands, and when the last shingle was nailed down, Frank Holloway let out a whoop that echoed through the neighborhood. Maggie stood in the yard, tears streaming down her face, and Colt realized he'd never seen her actually cry before. Not in front of people. Not where anyone could see her break. Duke pressed against her legs, and she sank her hands into his fur, and Frank came down the ladder and hugged her with the fierce tenderness of someone who understood that homes weren't just buildings. They were proof that you mattered, that your life had weight, that the world couldn't just erase you without consequence. "Welcome home, Maggie," Frank said. And she was, finally. After months of cold and fear and fighting, she was home. The first meal in the restored kitchen happened on a Saturday. Maggie insisted on cooking, despite protests from everyone, and she made soup, the same kind Colt had made for her that first night, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 20 people crowded into the small house, sitting on mismatched chairs, eating from borrowed bowls, and the conversation rose and fell like waves. Laughter happened, stories were told. Jax arm-wrestled Frank and lost deliberately. Marcus showed everyone pictures of his military dog. Elena interviewed volunteers for a follow-up piece. Deputy Chen stopped by in uniform and stayed for 2 hours because off-duty didn't mean off-duty when you cared. Colt stood in the doorway, watching all of it, and Maggie found him there. "You did this," she said softly. "No, we did this." "You opened the door first." "You knocked." She smiled, tired and genuine. "Stubborn man." "Stubborn woman." They stood together in comfortable silence, and Colt thought about his mother, about how she'd loved gatherings like this, how she'd filled their small house with people who needed feeding, how she'd believed that kindness was a choice you made every single day, not just when it was convenient. "She'd be proud of you," Maggie said, reading his mind. "I don't know about that." "I do." Maggie touched his arm briefly. "Grief tried to bury you, but you climbed out. That takes a kind of strength not everyone has." "I didn't do it alone." "No, that's the point. You let people help. That's the hardest part." Duke appeared between them, tail wagging, and Colt crouched down to scratch behind his ears. The dog's amber eyes were bright, alert, but calmer than they'd been in the blizzard, like he'd found his purpose again. Not in searching, not in rescuing, but in staying. In being present for people who needed presence more than they needed heroes. "Good boy," Colt murmured. "You brought us together, you know that?" Duke's tail thumped once. "He knows," Maggie said. The official celebration happened 2 weeks later, when the federal prosecutor announced formal charges against Garrett Kane and 12 others in the Summit Network. The news broke on a Thursday, and by Friday, Pinewood Ridge's community center was packed with people who'd come to bear witness to justice finally showing up, late but determined. Maggie spoke. Her voice was thin but steady, and she told her story without shame or apology. Told it the way it happened. The storm, the cold, the knock on a stranger's door, The dog who wouldn't let her give up. She didn't make Colt into a hero. She made him human. And somehow that meant more. When she finished, the room stood, not because protocol demanded it, because recognition did. Because they saw themselves in her survival. Colt didn't speak. Didn't need to. He stood with Jax and the Iron Ridge members, a wall of support that said more than words could. Afterward, in the parking lot, a young couple approached him. Mid-30s, holding hands, faces tight with hope and fear. "We're losing our house," the woman said. "Different company, but same pattern. We didn't know who to call until we heard about you." Colt looked at Jax. Jax nodded. "Tell me everything," Colt said. And as they talked, as he listened, as he started building a map in his head of who to call and what to do and how to fight, Colt realized something fundamental had changed. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was standing, right here, in the place where grief had tried to kill him and community had brought him back to life. And he was staying, not because it was easy, because it was right. Because sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is open a door when someone cold is knocking, and then refuse to close it again, no matter how hard the wind blows. The young couple's name was David and Rosa Chen. No relation to the deputy, they clarified quickly, and their story was Summit's blueprint with different names. Rosa worked as a home health aide, David as a mechanic, and when their furnace died in February, they'd borrowed $6,000 from a company called Apex Home Solutions. 3 months later, the payments had tripled, and foreclosure papers arrived with a 30-day deadline. Colt listened to every word, taking notes on a pad Jax handed him, and when they finished, he didn't make promises. He made a plan. "You got copies of your contracts?" "Everything," Rosa said, pulling a folder from her bag. "I keep records. My mother lost her house in California 5 years ago to something similar. I swore I'd never let it happen to me, but—" Her voice cracked. "But the numbers changed so fast." "That's how they work," Maggie said, appearing beside Colt with Duke at her side. "They count on you being too overwhelmed to fight back." Rosa looked at her with recognition blooming across her face. "You're Margaret Brennan. I saw you speak." "I am, and you're going to be fine. This man," Maggie nodded toward Colt, "he doesn't know how to quit. Neither do these men." She gestured to the Iron Ridge members. "You came to the right place." David's eyes filled. "We have 2 kids, 7 and 9. They don't understand why we might have to leave. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that your home isn't really yours?" Colt's throat tightened, thinking of his mother, of Maggie, of every person who'd built a life only to have it stolen by people in clean suits with legal documents. "You don't have to explain anything yet. Let us look at these papers. Let us make some calls. Can you give us 48 hours? David and Rosa nodded, desperate and grateful in equal measure. As they walked away, Jax turned to Colt. "You know what you just did?" "What?" "Made this permanent. You help them, word spreads. You'll have a line out the door by next week." Colt looked at Maggie, at Duke, at the Iron Ridge members who'd become brothers again without asking for anything in return. Good. The line did form. Within a week, Colt's phone was ringing constantly. People from Pinewood Ridge and beyond. People who'd heard what happened to Margaret Brennan and thought maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to fight alone. He set up a system quickly, triaging cases with Elena's help, connecting people with Deputy Chen when legal intervention was needed, organizing volunteer lawyers from Missoula who were willing to take predatory lending cases pro bono. The cabin changed, without him noticing at first. One morning he woke to find Jax and 2 club members setting up folding tables on the porch. By afternoon, Maggie had arrived with coffee and a sign-up sheet for something she called community hours. By evening, 12 people were sitting in Colt's living room, sharing stories, passing documents, building solidarity through shared rage and shared hope. "This isn't what I signed up for," Colt told Jax that night after everyone had left. Jax handed him a beer. "Yeah, it is. You just didn't know it yet. I came up here to be alone." "And you were, for 2 years. How'd that work out?" Colt didn't answer because they both knew the truth. Isolation had nearly killed him. Connection was the only thing keeping him alive. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through paperwork and persistence. Elena found the connection everyone had been looking for. Summit Property Solutions, Apex Home Solutions, and 4 other predatory lending companies were all subsidiaries of the same holding corporation, North Point Ventures, which was owned by a real estate mogul in Seattle who'd been operating the scheme across 7 states for over a decade. When she published the exposé, complete with corporate documents, victim testimonies, and a map showing the geographic spread of the operation, the story exploded. State attorneys general from Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Oregon announced a coordinated investigation. The FBI expanded their probe, and suddenly the quiet theft that had been happening in small towns across the West was national news. Garrett Kane flipped within 24 hours of the article dropping, took a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his bosses. The arrests rolled out like dominoes. CEOs, lawyers, county officials who'd taken bribes. By the end of the month, North Point Ventures was dissolved, its assets frozen, and restitution funds were being established for victims. Colt got the call while he was working on David and Rosa's case. Federal prosecutor, official voice, information delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. Margaret Brennan's house was being returned to her with full title, free of debt. David and Rosa's loan was voided. 37 families in Pinewood Ridge were getting their homes back. Over 200 families across 7 states were eligible for restitution. When he hung up, he sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle. Not triumph, exactly. More like the exhausted relief of someone who'd been holding their breath underwater and finally broke the surface. Jax found him there. "You good?" "We won," Colt said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Yeah, we did." "I don't know what to do with that." Jax sat down beside him. "You live with it. You let it mean something. You don't diminish it by pretending it was inevitable." "Feels impossible." "Most real things do." Jax clinked his beer bottle against Colt's. "To Maggie, to Duke, to stubborn old women and loyal dogs, and men who forgot how to give up." Colt drank, and the beer tasted like closure, like endings that made space for beginnings. Summer arrived with heat that felt personal, turning the mountain green and the town below into something almost beautiful. Colt started riding again, short trips at first, just to the grocery store or down to check on Maggie. Then longer ones with Jax beside him, the two of them cutting through mountain passes with the wind screaming past and the road unfolding like forgiveness. The Harley ran perfectly, every gear smooth, every mile earned. And Colt discovered that riding didn't hurt the way he'd feared it would. The memories were still there. Reese beside him, his mother waving from the porch. But they'd softened somehow, become part of the landscape instead of traps waiting to spring. One evening, he rode to his mother's grave for the first time since the funeral. Stood there with his helmet under his arm and told her everything. About Maggie, about Duke, about the fight and the fear, and the way community had dragged him back from the edge when he'd been determined to jump. "I think you'd like her," he said to the headstone. Maggie. She's stubborn, like you were. Doesn't take no for an answer. Doesn't let people fade into the background. The wind moved through the cemetery, and Colt imagined it was his mother's voice. Imagined her saying what she'd always said when he was younger and afraid. You're stronger than you think, baby. You just have to believe it. I'm trying, he whispered. I'm really trying. He stood there until the sun set, then rode home through darkness that felt less oppressive than it used to. The cabin lights were on when he arrived. Jax had started leaving them on when he knew Colt was out. A small kindness that said, I'm watching for you, brother. And inside was a note saying Maggie had stopped by with food. The container sat on the counter, still warm, and Colt ate standing up at the window, watching the mountain breathe, and thought about how healing happened in small increments. Not grand gestures, not dramatic moments, but in casseroles left by women who refused to let you starve, in lights left on by brothers who refused to let you disappear. The mentorship started accidentally when a young veteran named Tyler showed up at the cabin in August, referred by Deputy Chen, who'd become Sheriff Chen 2 months earlier after winning the election by a landslide. Tyler was 23, discharged from the Marines after an IED took his hearing in one ear and his best friend entirely. He'd been living in his truck for 6 weeks, moving between parking lots and rest stops, and his eyes carried the hollow weight Colt recognized immediately. I don't need therapy, Tyler said before Colt could speak. I need work. I need purpose. Chen said you might know someone hiring. Colt studied him. Too thin, too wired. The kind of energy that came from running on fumes and adrenaline. When did you eat last? I'm not here for charity. Neither was I. When did you eat? Tyler's jaw clenched. Yesterday, maybe. Colt gestured him inside, started making sandwiches without asking permission, and Tyler's resistance crumbled in the face of food and warmth and someone who didn't ask questions designed to fix him. They ate in silence for a while, and then Colt said, Iron Ridge is looking for a mechanic. Jax runs the garage, pays fair, doesn't ask about your past unless you offer it. I'm not a biker. Neither was I when I started. But I could work on engines, and that mattered more than what I wore. Tyler's hands shook around his sandwich. Why are you helping me? Because someone helped me when I didn't deserve it. And because sitting alone in a truck pretending you're fine is a slow way to die. And I'm tired of watching people die slowly. The words landed hard, and Tyler's eyes filled. He looked away quickly, ashamed, but Colt had been there too many times to let shame win. It's okay, Colt said quietly. Whatever you're carrying, it's okay to be tired of carrying it alone. Tyler stayed for 3 days, slept on the couch, ate regular meals, worked alongside Colt on small projects that didn't require conversation. On the 3rd day, Jax showed up and offered him the job, and Tyler took it with hands that shook less than they had when he'd arrived. After he left, Maggie called. She'd heard about Tyler through the network, the invisible web of people who watched out for each other now. You're good at this, she said. At what? Saving people without making them feel saved. I'm not saving anyone, just offering a couch and a sandwich. That's what saving looks like, Maggie replied. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. By October, the cabin had become a way station for people who needed somewhere to exist without judgment. Tyler brought other veterans. Jax brought bikers dealing with addiction or loss. Elena brought people whose homes had been saved, but whose spirits were still recovering. They came, they stayed for a few hours or a few days, and they left carrying something they hadn't arrived with. Hope, maybe. Or just the knowledge that someone cared enough to leave the door unlocked. Colt didn't plan it, didn't advertise it, but word spread the way truth always did in small communities. Quietly, person to person, like light passing from candle to candle. Maggie became a fixture, showing up twice a week with Duke to cook meals that fed a dozen people. She'd regained weight, her cough was gone, and she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd survived the worst and decided to make the survival count. "You're not going home?" Colt asked one evening when she was still there past midnight. "I am home," she said, gesturing to the room full of people talking, laughing, sharing pain and hope in equal measure. "This is what home looks like now." Duke lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by people who reached down to touch him as they passed, and the dog's tail wagged in a lazy rhythm that said contentment, safety, purpose. The first snow came in late November, soft and deliberate, coating the mountain in white that felt less like burial and more like blessing. Colt stood on the porch at dawn watching it fall, coffee warming his hands, and heard the door open behind him. Maggie joined him, wrapped in a blanket, Duke pressing between them. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yeah." "You ever think about that night? The blizzard?" Colt nodded. "Every day." "Me too." She was quiet for a moment. "I knocked on your door because I was dying. But you opened it because you were dying too. We saved each other, I think." "I don't know about that." "I do." Maggie looked at him. "Grief is a kind of blizzard, Colt. It's cold and it's relentless, and it makes you think the only solution is to find somewhere isolated and wait for it to pass. But it doesn't pass. You have to walk through it with other people, or it buries you." Colt's throat tightened. "My mother used to say something similar. She'd say, 'Baby, you can't outrun sorrow, but you can outlast it if you hold someone's hand while you wait.'" She was right. They stood together as the sun rose, painting the snow gold and pink. And Colt thought about his mother, about Reese, about all the ways loss had tried to define him, and how he'd finally learned to define himself by what he chose to do with the survival. Behind them, the cabin was full of sleeping people. Tyler on the couch, 2 other veterans in sleeping bags on the floor, Jax in the spare room because he'd stopped going home most nights, preferring brotherhood to isolation. "What do we do now?" Maggie asked. "We keep the door open," Colt said. "We keep showing up. We keep believing that kindness matters even when the world says it doesn't." "That simple?" "That complicated." Maggie smiled, and Duke's tail thumped against the porch boards. And somewhere below them, the town was waking up to another day, another chance, another opportunity to choose connection over isolation. The year ended with a gathering at Maggie's house, now fully restored, warm and sturdy, filled with furniture donated by people who'd heard the story and wanted to help. 30 people crowded into the small space, eating food brought from every kitchen in town, telling stories that made them laugh and cry in equal measure. Elena announced her nonprofit had secured funding to help 50 more families across 3 states. Sheriff Chen announced new county ordinances protecting elderly homeowners from predatory practices. Jax announced that Iron Ridge was officially partnering with the VA to provide job training for veterans. And Colt sat quietly in the corner, watching it all unfold, feeling the weight of his mother's photograph in his pocket. He'd started carrying it, a talisman against forgetting what mattered, and understanding finally what she'd been trying to teach him all those years. Healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about making the pain mean something. It was about taking what tried to destroy you and turning it into fuel for protecting others. Tyler approached him near midnight, face flushed from beer and warmth and belonging. "I got my first paycheck today." "Yeah?" Yeah, and I'm putting a deposit down on an apartment next week. His voice cracked. I just wanted to say thank you. For the couch, for the food, for not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. Colt gripped his shoulder. You did the work. I just held the door open. That's all anyone needed you to do. After everyone left, after Maggie and Duke had gone home and Jax had passed out on the couch again, Colt walked outside into the cold November night and looked at the stars scattered across the black sky like promises. He thought about the night Maggie knocked, the way Duke had refused to move, the way he'd almost not answered, the way a single choice had changed the trajectory of so many lives. He thought about his mother, about Reese, about every person he'd loved and lost and carried forward. And he understood, finally, that they weren't gone. They lived in every door he opened, in every hand he extended, in every person he chose not to leave behind. The mountain was quiet around him, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of isolation, but the peace of knowing morning would bring more people, more stories, more chances to prove that survival was worth celebrating, and that kindness wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing anyone could offer. Duke appeared beside him, limping slightly in the cold, and pressed against his leg. Colt's hand dropped to the dog's head, and they stood together, watching the night breathe. Two survivors who'd found purpose in protecting others, who'd learned that the opposite of grief wasn't forgetting, but loving anyway, choosing connection even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Good boy, Colt whispered. Good boy. And somewhere in the darkness, in the spaces between stars, he felt his mother's presence like a hand on his shoulder, felt Reese's spirit in the wind, felt the weight of every loss transform into permission to live fully, fiercely, with doors unlocked and hearts open. The story that began with a knock in a blizzard had become a movement. One person opening a door, one woman refusing to disappear, one dog who wouldn't let either of them give up. And from that single act of desperate courage and reluctant kindness, a community had been born, fragile and fierce, imperfect and essential. Miracles didn't arrive with trumpets or thunder. They arrived as an old woman in a snowstorm, as a dog with amber eyes who understood loyalty better than language, as a grieving man who'd forgotten how to care until caring became the only thing that mattered. And they continued in every morning after, in every door held open, in every hand extended to someone stumbling through their own blizzard. Colt Mercer had come to the mountain to die slowly and alone. Instead, he'd learned that the bravest thing anyone can do is live deliberately and together, that salvation comes to those who offer it to others, and that home isn't a place you find. It's a door you choose to open when someone cold is standing on the other side, waiting to be seen, waiting to be saved, waiting to discover that they were never as alone as they believed. The cabin lights stayed on through the night. The fire burned steady. The door remained unlocked. And when morning came, with its fresh snow and new chances, Colt Mercer was still there, standing, breathing, ready to answer the next knock, ready to prove that one person choosing kindness over comfort could change the world, one frozen soul at a time.